Shalom and welcome everyone to the ICEJ webinar series. I'm David Parsons, one of the vice presidents here at the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem and our senior spokesman. And we're just pleased everyone for joining us. We're going to have today an update on the Gaza War. We're at day 97 or so of Israel's effort to uproot Hamas from Gaza following the horrific massacres of October 7th. And our guest is Major Elliot Chutoff. He's in the IDF reserves, but has been in active duty over recent months, helping with the effort with the Southern Command. And we're going to get an update from him. We talked to him about 2 months ago, and we'll see how things are going now with the fighting in Gaza, also the other fronts such as Hezbollah in the north and what's happening in Judea, Samaria. A little background on Elliot. Good to see you, Elliot.
Good to be here.
Yes. Now, a little background. He's a leading Israeli military and security analyst with 35 years of experience in the Israeli army. He's written IDF field manuals, training manuals. He's a trusted consultant on the war on terrorism, on counterterrorism. I think he's advised companies and others and even given testimony in different countries around the world. And he still serves with the IDF Home Front Command. And after the Hamas massacres of October 7th, he was called up by this IDF Southern Command to help with their campaign in Gaza and especially on the Israeli side to help with the civilian resilience. So, Elliot, can you give us first a little update on what the Southern Command had you doing and what's your current role with the IDF?
What I was doing primarily was trying to assess and then advise on how to get the communities to return to the kibbutzim, moshavim, sderot. And along with that, obviously one of the primary issues was security. So dealing with what are the security needs down there, present and future, in order for people to go back after the horrific events of the 7th, which it's no great secret was a shattering of, among other things, belief and reliance on the IDF to protect them. I mean, there's no other way of describing the 7th as a tremendous failure of the IDF to perform its mission in protecting the communities of the South. So it was something amorphous. And one of the things that was clear after being down there a couple of days is that there are no models or paradigms to use for this event. It was, I hate the word unique, but this is a unique event, at least in Israel's history, that where you can't simply open up the textbooks and the history books and say, okay, this is what happened in the past. Let's see what worked and let's see what didn't work. It's much more a make it up as you go along based on experience, knowledge, and professional intuition. I have to say, in decades of doing this kind of work.
Yeah, hijacking 3 airplanes at once, like the PLO did, I think, back in the 70s. That's one thing, but this is unprecedented and over such a long swath of area of, I don't know, 40 miles or so along the Gaza border and into Israel. All these communities just felt so unsafe in their homes, these home invasions. All Israelis felt that.
Right. I mean, the ripple effect on the country was enormous. I live in the north, and we're still feeling the psychological effects in that all the towns and villages up here, very, very far from Gaza, we've instituted 24-hour-a-day guard duty, security, all sorts of things that you might say might have been necessary from the outset, but now there's an awareness of it on an entirely different level, and that's part of the ripple effect. I would say that if you think about the shock of 9/11 in the U.S. and the security ripple effect of psychology, that followed that, we're in, I would say, a much greater, more intense situation than even then.
Yeah, and there's been about 100,000 Israeli civilians displaced, evacuated from 5 to 7 kilometers along the border in the north. It's a long border with many bends and turns and rough terrain, and then down south another 100,000 or more from there.
Right.
And look, we know a lot of these folks. We were helping, especially down along the Gaza border, with bomb shelters, firefighting equipment. We've seen and met some of these people post October 7th, and they're kibbutzi moshavim who have a collective mentality. They make decisions together, not as individual families, but as communities. And this isn't easy for the IDF to help them make those decisions about all of them moving back. They want to stay together, as far as I understand.
Yes, and in some cases, it's physically impossible for them to move back, either because there was so much damage done to infrastructure that it'll take a while to just get everything up and running properly, but also the communities that are closest to the Gaza border are still military zones. And I don't mean just technically closed military area, which is a legal standing, and I don't belittle it, but some of these are still actually in the center of our operations. And one of the things that people in the military know, but I think the average civilian is not familiar with, is that when a tank rolls through your town, it tears up the roads, it tears up the water lines, underground electric lines, sewage lines, communications lines. Not out of any malice. It's just what happens when an 80-something ton vehicle goes on tracks, goes driving down your streets. So there's a great deal of damage that's been done, just residual, in the north and the south, by virtue of the fact that of our massive military presence there, dealing with war situations, frankly, on both fronts.
Yeah, we dedicated a new Christian Embassy Nature Park right along the border at the Anzac Monument, right near Kibbutz Be'eri, 2 days before October 7th.
Wow.
And we haven't been able to go and see what our nature park looks like, but we're going to have to totally replant it and rebuild
No
it.
question. No question.
Because it's right at one of the main entry points for the IDF into Gaza. But like Kibbutz Be'eri, which was very hard hit on October 7th, they already have their municipal building back operating. We've been there and seen people in their offices. They've got their printing press. They got they're planting. They've already planted winter wheat. That's one community that is trying to get back as quick as they can. And the rocket threat has been reduced, hasn't it? There's not as many rockets coming.
The rocket threat has been greatly reduced. I hate to make predictions about these sort of things because Hamas is still out there and operating, but I would put it a different way. These are communities that have been living under rocket threat for decades. So for them, the rocket threat is, I don't know, a better word to use than tolerable in terms of living. Obviously, I don't want to go back to it, and I don't blame them. But if it were only the rocket threat, then I think that many of them would go back. And as you said, many have gone back within all sorts of restrictions. But the shock of what happened on the 7th was an entirely different breaking of reliance on the IDF, on its commitment, promises. I mean, I know that the Army meant the commitment seriously, but it didn't follow through. It didn't live up to expectations. So the population there and up north is far more sensitive today than it was prior to the 7th, not willing to rely on promises and commitments, because now it's become really, show me, don't just tell me.
Yeah. There was a major New York Times article in recent days. The sort of headline was that Netanyahu, the prime minister, wants to fight Hezbollah in the north next to prolong his career, but it never mentioned, not one time in this whole long article, why the Israeli communities, even on the northern border, are afraid to go back. It's not so much the rockets, it's those cross-border infiltrations and home invasions that Hezbollah is even more capable than Hamas of doing that. Yeah.
Indeed, that's the threat. That was the reason they were evacuated in the first place. Hezbollah has an assault operations unit called Radwan, named, by the way, after Imad Murnia, who we took out many years ago in Damascus, but he was the guy who was, among other things, responsible for the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut back in the 80s.
He was the main liaison between Hezbollah and the Iran Revolutionary.
That too, but he was a major operations planner and executor in terms of terrorist attacks. In other words, he wasn't just a diplomat. Let's put it that way.
But the Radwan force, named for him, an elite commando force trained by Hezbollah to do these cross-border invasions.
Right. Their mission, stated mission, trained mission, is to come across the border and do exactly what Hamas did on October 7th, except on a larger scale, higher level of training, higher level of organization. Here I have to say, with all of the horrific things that happened on the 7th, and I'm not going to discuss details in public, the Hamas attackers made a number of errors that I don't believe that Hezbollah would make.
Mm-hmm.
So, as horrific as it was, unfortunately, it could always be worse. And one of the reasons that it wasn't is because of errors that they made. And as I said, I don't expect Hezbollah to make the same mistakes.
They got caught up in the joy of slaughtering people and whatever, and Hezbollah would move on more quickly. Okay, look, there's so many things we can talk about, but we want a basic update on what's happening in Gaza, and then talk about the possible transition to an escalation on the north. How much progress has the IDF made in dismantling Hamas in Gaza?
Okay, first of all, the IDF has made tremendous progress. The question is, do we measure progress from the starting point to where we are, or from where we are to the end point? We're still far from the end point. We have essentially dismantled Hamas's military structure in what is commonly referred to as the north of the Gaza Strip, I think better understood as Gaza City and its neighborhoods and suburbs.
Which is over 1 million people in that area. It's the most heavily populated.
It's a huge urban area, urban, suburban, associated villages like Bet Hanun and Bet Lahia. That area was under the control of 2 Hamas brigades, some 14 battalions, all of which have been, for all intents and purposes, destroyed as organizations. In addition to that, above ground and below ground, taken over their training bases, their warehouses, their storehouses, their operational bases underground, their command centers, their intelligence centers, part of that tunnel network that's been spoken about so much. Hundreds of shafts, vertical shafts, and here we need to understand when we talk about the tunnel network, there are really a number of aspects. One is the vertical part of it, the shafts that come up from below and open above ground, inside of buildings, in parks, in hospitals, playgrounds, you name it, where they can pop up and fire on Israeli troops and then disappear back underground again. So hundreds of those have been found and destroyed. Underground, what I'll call the horizontal network, includes a transit, what we used to call the metro. In other words, connecting tunnels between all sorts of different areas, between the shafts, between rooms, barracks, and things like that. And at another level, even deeper, command centers from which they were running operations. In northern Gaza, in the Gaza City area, for all intents and purposes, we've dismantled that network. Now, I'm careful. I'm sure we haven't gotten every last one of them, But as as far as a centralized operating military force, Hamas in the Gaza City environs no longer exists. What that means is two things. One is that we have taken over the territory and we're now no longer advancing, and that has pros and cons. Not advancing means we are now static. Initiative is going over to the other side by nature, and one of the things that I've always taught in tactics and in my lectures, taking the town very often is easier than holding it. Now, when he wants it back, or in this case, in a guerrilla warfare situation, we're going to be establishing ourselves in places, and they're going to know where we are. When you're in the initiative, so you're in one place today, you're in a different place tomorrow, and they're playing catch up. So we're likely to see more small-scale attacks coming out of that area than we've seen even over the past few weeks and months. But nonetheless, from an organizational point of view, that area is secured. And the result is that we've pulled 2 divisions out of the 3 that were operating there. In the southern part of the strip, as it's called, which is the Khan Yunis and Rafiah area, 2 other cities, we're talking about something on the scale of Tel Aviv, we're still operating. We have not really gotten into Rafiah, and Rafiah is critical because that's the city that's along the border with Egypt. The route that runs along the border that is codenamed Philadelphia or Philadelphia by us. Of course, everybody in the world who's followed this knows the name of the route already. It's not a secret, although that's the code name. Under that route is where the tunnels run that bring supplies into for Hamas and allow them to move people in and out. And one of the concerns that we have is that they'll try to take hostages out that way.
Yeah, hostages and senior Hamas leaders.
And senior Hamas leaders. And here I'll say the senior Hamas leaders concern us less than the hostages.
Hmm.
I mean, in the sense that, yes, we would rather get them in Gaza, but ultimately we will get them.
You get them. But what about Egypt? They say they've destroyed them all. They even flooded some of them.
They have. They've destroyed many. All is overstating it. We know that they're still operating. They're operating maybe in smaller quantities, but if we're talking about, as we just were, hostages and leaders, it only requires one to be operating, and they have a conduit to.
Yeah. Egypt doesn't have the same motivation that Israel does in rooting out these tunnels.
That's true. They also don't have the same capabilities for a whole bunch of reasons.
Do you want to help them?
Well, here's the problem. Sinai is functionally demilitarized because of the agreement between us and Egypt from 1979. So the forces that they have there are not exactly their top troops, and that's good for us. We don't want, top heavy Egyptian military forces along our border. The price we pay for it is somewhat less security on the other side because they're not on the level to be doing the kind of work that we need them to be doing. It's a dilemma. It's not one with a simple good solution. I think the right solution is the one that we're keeping to, and that is making sure that Egypt doesn't turn into a strategic threat and then deal with everything else as best we can.
Yeah.
Now, that leaves us with Khan Yunis, which is where most of the fighting is going on today. Yeah. That's the center of Hamas. They are underground. We have a pretty good idea where they are. I wouldn't get it down to the pinpoint.
Including Sinwar.
Including Sinwar and his brother Sinwar, Def, and others. That's where the real hardcore leadership is. Certainly surrounded by hostages. And here the work is, and I think that this is really the bottom line. It looks like not much is going on because every day what's going on is very slow, careful, meticulous work. We're trying to do it for 2 reasons. One is to keep our casualties to a minimum. And thank God so far we've succeeded in keeping to a minimum, given the scale of the operation, the scale of the urban fighting. Second, our casualties include hostages. And third, their casualties in terms of civilians, despite the farce that's going on today in the international court in The Hague, claiming that Israel's committing genocide. We've been extremely careful about not injuring and killing non-combatants. and not 100% successful, and you never are in warfare, and certainly not in urban warfare. But both the numbers and the actions show that we're being very, very methodical, careful about going after military targets and keeping non-combatant casualties to a minimum. What that all
Yeah.
translates into is a very, very slow, not spectacular operation.
Look, the IDF has announced that we've got operational control in the north and we're withdrawing troops. And all of a sudden, the media is reporting that the Gaza war is almost over and the IDF has to come back. No, there's intense fighting in the center and in the south, and that's going to take a few more weeks. I think some estimates say by the end of March, Israel may have a real grip on most of Gaza.
I hate to give those kind of time estimates. They usually end up blowing up in your face. I would say that we'll know it's over when it's over.
Mhm.
It may, and it could take longer or less time. Look, there could be a ceasefire going into effect to get hostages released. Keeping in mind that that's part of the mission. That can add weeks. Not only will it add a week or two or three or whatever of a ceasefire, but then it means starting up again and all the reacceleration costs in terms of time. So I'm not going to commit to February, March, April, June, or whatever.
Okay.
I also think that kind of pressure is foolish. The army could very easily stop and say, you know what, we have to actually slow this down. We need to be more methodical. We've hit, as it is, we found a tunnel system far beyond what was estimated by intelligence before the war. And life is full of surprises. In warfare, most of them are not good. So I would say, with all of the media's interest in having a new story every day, I think here we're likely, for the most part, to see the same story repeated day in and day out, with occasional successes that are noteworthy. But most of these are going to be, I hate to use the word mundane, but mundane in the sense of another day of killing some more terrorists, finding some more tunnel shafts, clearing another tunnel, finding more rocket launchers, more arms caches, and that sort of thing. And each day is going to start looking a lot like previous ones with not a lot to report for the media. What can I say too bad about them?
Yeah. Look, when you talk about the pace of the fighting and the deliberate, very cautious approach of the IDF, there is a lot of pressure from the U.S., from others, to get this over, and especially to let some of the Gazan civilians move back to the north, which I think would be disastrous to allow that prematurely. Correct?
Absolutely. First of all, we know that among the so-called civilians are plenty of Hamas terrorists. And at the price of getting civilians out so that we could limit casualties, we know that terrorists escaped with them and went out into the humanitarian areas. And that means they'll come back, and we'll have to start all over again to a certain extent. If they do come back, it'll also make it more difficult for us to do precisely that, because now we'll have civilians once again mixed in with terrorists. Civilian casualties will go up. And I think in all the bad choices that we have, and they're all bad choices, the better choice is to keep the population out for a while longer, and to enable the military on the ground to do the job, rather than face a resurgent Hamas that will be less prepared to deal with.
Yeah, I think it's one of the best, about the best leverage Israel has in all the negotiations that are going on about a post-war Gaza. We're not leaving until certain things are accomplished.
Right.
And the civilians aren't going back. What sort of progress has the IDF made in the three set goals: dismantling Hamas, returning the hostages, and restoring a sense of security along the border communities? We sort of addressed any of those, but the hostage issue, is there any update? It looks like the pattern is is that as soon as you get close to any of them, they're executing them, dumping their bodies somewhere.
Yeah. First of all, I'm not convinced that the number that we're announcing officially is correct. Unfortunately, I think they've killed many more than, in absence of knowledge, we list everybody.
The
But
official record, official numbers given out right now: 132 hostages still believed in Gaza. Around 25 of them, there's
some sort of
evidence they're
critical.
dead, but it could be much higher.
Right. So, look, we're not going to play guessing games. We have to behave as if everybody's alive until we're sure otherwise. But my belief is that the numbers are significantly lower. I don't have an actual number
Of live
but
hostages.
of live hostages.
Hmm.
And they're going to hold on to them. Look, for them, that's their bargaining card.
That's their
They
best
have-
leverage. Yeah.
It's the only leverage. Look, they have at this point two objectives that are that are closely connected. One is that they, meaning the leaders, survive the experience, the Hamas leaders, and two, that Hamas remain in control of Gaza in the aftermath. That's what they want. They've said it outright. They won't negotiate over anything less than that. And in order to achieve that, an immediate end of the Israeli military operation in Gaza. Now, the truth is, they have no reason to back down off of that. And we have absolutely no reason to give them any of it. So it's kind of hard to have a serious negotiation between two sides that have absolutely no overlap in common, that you can discuss. I think they were terrifically surprised by our response. I think they're still terrifically surprised by the tenacious continuation of this operation. They were thinking something much more along the lines of, well, a week or two of bombardment, maybe some raids, and then we'll get back to business as usual. And now they're really in a situation where they don't have a lot to compromise over. It's either end it or they're finished. And I'm afraid that that's where we're going to end up with the negotiations. In other words, I don't see, life is full of surprises. I don't see Hamas agreeing to release a significant number of hostages for a week or two of breathing space.
Sadly, I agree. I think they realize they're already in the end game here, and these hostages are the only thing keeping them alive. Yeah. Look, at some point, whether a few months down the road, whether it's March or a little later, a lot of the intensive military advances in Gaza, going in and rooting out terror tunnels and everything in different new areas, it's going to come to an end. And you go to another sort of phase in Gaza where it's more holding the territory, as you say. And then the question shifts, the transition to whether Israel takes on Hezbollah in the north, which is where you live and really what you've specialized over recent years or decades. And first of all, are you surprised Hezbollah has not escalated more than it has? It hasn't joined an all-out war. It looks to me there's been opportunities to do it, but Nasrallah and Hezbollah, and I guess Iran, they want to preserve that threat and not have it taken out now.
I think their original plan was to go in. I think they were tremendously surprised by Israel's response actions of October 8th, 9th, 10th, in the aftermath of the Hamas attack, including immediately declaring that this was a war, something that we had always hesitated. In 2006, when we had the 34-day war with Hezbollah, was in July and August of 2006. The government decided that it was a war only in March of 2007. Now, you might think, well, what difference does it make? But in fact, by saying it's a war, it changes all sorts of legal status situations in the country. It also changes all sorts of procedural things inside of the army, and I won't go into details, but it has to do with how much intelligence is released to the forces, how the forces are organized and sent. There are ramifications. So that declaration on the 7th was more than simply symbolic. Second, calling up the reserves in the numbers and at the speed that it was done in that week in the aftermath, I think surprised everybody on the other side. By the way, it surprised a bunch of us on this side as well. In my case, positively; in their case, negatively. Instead of thinking, I'm sure they did, as happened in 2006, that they were going to be facing an IDF that was bogged down in Gaza or around Gaza, and now would have to run between a northern front and a southern front. Suddenly, they were facing hundreds of thousands of reservists in the north, while Hamas was facing hundreds of thousands of reservists and a good part of the regular army in the south. So that was an oops moment, I think, for Hezbollah. Controversial as it is, evacuating the communities of the northern border made it less attractive for Hezbollah, because now they have no real means of gaining a short-term tactical victory. In other words, grabbing an empty kibbutz along the border does them no good whatsoever. So why start under those circumstances? And last but not least, when we finally did go into Gaza on the ground and started doing what we've been doing since, how did Defense Minister Gallant say a few days ago? In case Hezbollah isn't paying attention, we can do copy paste on them to what we're doing here, and everybody knows it. That's not an idle threat. So they're caught in the horns of a dilemma. Too bad. But the dilemma is, on the one hand, they can't be seen just sitting back and doing nothing as we're pounding Hamas and dismantling it. On the other hand, no, they don't want to have happen to them what's happening to Hamas in Gaza. So they're operating in this sort of middle zone of keeping the border hot, firing primarily either at evacuated towns and villages. They're causing damage, but there's no real civilian population there, or at military targets, which we've shown over the years, and I don't agree with this, but it's an understandable policy, that we will accept a certain amount of violence against our military and will respond with violence, but that'll be within what can be loosely called the rules of the game. And they haven't violated those rules significantly over the past few months.
They did hit the listening and radar controls on Mount Meron, and then the Northern Command headquarters in Sfat.
Those are military targets.
Military targets, but it was minimal damage, so Israel can live with that for now.
Exactly. And as I said, I don't personally agree with that, but it's an understandable policy. Yeah. It's not a crazy policy.
Look, if Hezbollah doesn't want to up the ante and go all out war, that puts the ball in Israel's court. And this transition, at some point, most of the work is done in Gaza, and you now change the focus to the northern border. Should Israel go in? Or should the diplomatic effort, if they agree to some sort of symbolic even withdrawal above the Litani River voluntarily, or get sort of pressured into it, should Israel hold back, or is it inevitable and necessary for Israel to go after Hezbollah next?
I don't know about inevitable, but I do believe it's necessary. In my opinion, leaving them in place is a recipe for disaster. First of all, the communities of the north are not going back so quickly. Here again, they might have convinced themselves up until October 7th that they were secure. Now they're sure that they're not secure. And leaving Hezbollah in the position that it was on October 7th is a non-starter for the communities along the north, and that includes Kiryat Shmona and Shlomi, not just kibbutzim and moshavim along the border. So I think it's highly unlikely that we will leave Hezbollah in place, and I think it's folly to make the arrangement as a diplomatic negotiated one, because we know very well that their adherence to those kind of agreements is very close to zero. Over time, if nothing else, it's absolutely zero. In other words, they can withdraw beyond the Litani today and start straggling back tomorrow. And then the question always becomes, and this is a difficult one in strategy and in global diplomatic strategy. Okay, so we got them back across the Litani by agreement. Tomorrow, 20 of them come back across. Do we start a war over 20? And then the next day, 20 more come across. Do we start a war over another 20? And that's the thinking. In other words, there can be 1,000 of them across and another 20 come across. Well, if you've accepted 1,000, then it's only 20. And we would very quickly find ourselves right back where we started. And now with the world saying, but you have an agreement. Now, how can you violate such an agreement? I think it's much more likely and more prudent from a strategic point of view. The army is mobilized. We're set up. We're already in a war footing. The economy is taking the hit. Now is the time to drive them back.
Especially with Russia preoccupied with its own war, it really gives Israel a unique moment to stand up to Iran through this. It's the most dangerous of all its proxies.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Look, one of the signs that we're shifting to the war in the north would be moving some of the Iron Dome batteries up there. Are you able to share anything? The rocket threat is being reduced constantly from Gaza. Their rocket arsenals in Hamas are being depleted. They're being destroyed. They have less areas to shoot from. But how do you know? Can you share if some of these batteries have been moved to the north? How protected is the north right now?
Okay, so first of all, as far as I know, batteries have not been moved to the north. Certainly not in any significant number. But here, I think it's important to understand the Iron Dome is not going to be that effective against Hezbollah, simply because of the numbers that they're capable of firing.
Overwhelm it.
Yes.
Okay.
And unlike Hamas, which of course on the 7th fired quite a large number of rockets, Hezbollah has many times that capability, longer range, more accurate, and much greater launch capability. In other words, simultaneous launch, which is what we're concerned with. And if we're talking about Iron Dome, how many rockets can they put in the air simultaneously across the front? At which point, as you say, the system is overwhelmed. It's not that it won't operate at its full capacity, but its full capacity will be nowhere near the quantity necessary to deal with Hezbollah's firepower. And
you coordinate that with all sorts of armed drones come over at the same time. It's a dangerous formula. Look, I have a Knesset source who told me yesterday that the Iron Beam, this new laser system that can shoot down all sorts of rockets and mortars and missiles and is much more efficient cost-wise in doing this, that it is operational and some of the batteries have been deployed.
I've heard that. I'm old school.
Yeah. And you're right in it. The high tech relying on tech too much. That was the mistake of October 7.
Yeah. So I still believe that the way to stop the rocket threat is at its source, and not at its, on the delivery end,
which ultimately requires a ground invasion.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And the drone game, Israel's a little better at this, but how serious is the drone threat from the Iranian proxies, but especially in Lebanon?
The drone threat is a real threat. I don't think that it's qualitatively more serious than any other indirect fire artillery rocket. It's part of that whole package, and it can be partially intercepted, partially interdicted, but it comes back to what I said earlier. The solution is stopping it at its source, not at its delivery end. We can shoot some down, we can jam some, We mess with the drones use GPS. We mess with GPS. Every other day I turn on my phone and I find out that I'm in Beirut and not in northern Israel. Some people find that they're in Cairo. GPS is doing all sorts of weird stuff, and that's us jamming and ghosting and things like that. But ultimately, in all of these cases, the way you stop enemy fire is by stopping the enemy, not by defending against the fire itself.
Mhm. And look, it may be a little early to really talk about how a ground invasion into southern Lebanon might play out, but you have three main areas of Hezbollah's strength. In the south, in the villages, in South Beirut, where this strike against Hamas senior leader, his office was in the middle of Hezbollah's civilian in the urban center, and then in the Bekaa Valley, and lots of tunnels, lots of rockets. It would be a tough fight.
It's a tough fight, and Hezbollah is better trained, organized, and equipped than Hamas. Here we're talking about a real army that knows what it's doing.
With experience in Syria.
With experience in Syria. As a matter of fact, the commander of the Radwan force we took out a few days ago gained a lot of combat experience in Syria. It's one of the reasons that he was the dangerous character that he was. Here we should mention that taking out these leaders are always have two aspects to it. One is the symbolic and the other is the operational. Some are more symbolic than operational, and some are the other way around. In his case, it was both. Taking out a leader of the Radwan force is symbolic, but he wasn't simply a figurehead. He was a truly experienced, trained operational commander.
Yes.
So that hurts them, not just hurting the consciousness of the system, but they are very good.
Yeah.
And we'll have to deal with that.
And what's your assessment of the Lebanese armed forces? Are they in for a fight with Israel joining Hezbollah? Are they going to stand aside? There's even some people saying they're arming, especially the Christian militias, in order to defend themselves and to help beat Hezbollah, get rid of Hezbollah's grip over their country.
The Lebanese armed forces are nothing to really talk about in terms of real warfare. That Lebanon could very, very easily disintegrate once again into chaos is highly likely. And it's one of the reasons that the Lebanese government is trying also to come to some sort of terms. It's one of the reasons France is so involved. Lebanon is a sort of stepchild. But you know, it's a fragile country to begin with. It's been that way for decades, and the possibility of it, as I said, of it disintegrating is very, very high in the case of a major war with Hezbollah.
Yeah. All right. Finally, the other front, Judea, Samaria, the West Bank. Does the IDF have that front under control now? Some say it's all going to explode, but it seems there's been some terror incidents, but in a way, it's nothing out of the normal.
Right. It's been slightly more intensive in Judea and Samaria, as in Gaza, although not to the same extent. We've taken pretty much a hands-off approach over the years. We've gone in and dealt with high-end intelligence markers of terrorists and terrorist organizations and leaders, but really not gone in any strength to dismantle it. And we're paying some of the price for that now also in terms of their munitions, their IEDs doing damage, the numbers that we're seeing, their level of organization, and there at least we're preempting in the sense that the operations are ours. We've always since 2002, we've had a much greater presence in Judea and Samaria militarily than we did in Gaza. And here, let's keep in mind, everybody talks about the disengagement of 2005. We pulled out of Gaza in 1994 and 1995 after Oslo. There were still Jewish communities there until 2005, but we were not operating in Rafiah, Khan Yunis, Gaza City, and those places already back to from the mid-90s. So in Judea and Samaria, that was also the case, but we went back in following Chomat Magen in the spring of 2002. So there we've got much more going on, much better intelligence, much more force on the ground, much better control between the cities of the roads. It's not absolute, but the likelihood of an explosion there is much limited, mitigated by the operations that we've had ongoing now for the past couple of months.
And how serious is the tunnel threat? There's a lot of Jewish communities saying we are hearing tunneling in Judea, Samaria. We're afraid they're going to tunnel into our communities. And there's even some concern that in the Tulkarm area, for instance, the militias there have already tunneled under Highway 6, which is this huge main artery, north-south artery for Israel now.
I wouldn't dismiss it, but tunneling in Judea and Samaria is a much more difficult prospect than tunneling in Gaza. Remember that the substrate in Gaza is sand. Now, that has its own challenges, and we've seen the pictures of all the tunnels being shored up with concrete walls, concrete arches, and that sort of thing. But the actual digging in sand is much, much easier. In Judea and Samaria, we're talking about limestone, much more complicated. And once again, I never say never, but the extent of what we saw in Gaza, we will not see in Judea and Samaria.
Well, Hezbollah's been able to do it, but they've been able to bring in North Korean tunneling equipment, and
even there, not to the extent of what we've seen in Gaza.
Okay. All right. Well, that's one of the big takeaways, that the tunnels are even more than you thought. And we appreciate that insight. We thank you, IDF Major in the Reserves, Elliot Chadoff. And we thank you for your time, your expertise, your insights here on the ICJ webinar series.
My pleasure.
Thank you for being with us once again. We hope you got a lot from today's interview. We also want to remind you, yesterday we interviewed Andrew Tucker, an international lawyer who's based in the Netherlands, where these cases are coming up against Israel in The Hague. And we talked about this genocide petition against Israel filed by South Africa, which the hearing is already underway as we speak now. The first bank of hearings before the judges, and it'll be today and tomorrow, and some more activity next week. But you can learn all about that on our go to our YouTube channel or our Facebook channel, and watch that interview on our webinar series. And of course, at the top of the hour, 4 p.m. Israel time, we have our daily global prayer gathering today. So join us then to pray with Christians from all around the world for Israel and its war against these enemies. We thank you for being with us. God bless you from Jerusalem.
Thank you for joining us for this informative webinar. Be sure to subscribe to our social media channels or visit our website at icej.org for upcoming webinars and more ICEJ exclusive content.